Now I think it's best that before we go back to 40k, we should have a nice little lore video to wrap up my fantasy spree. And this is a special one because I didn't have to come up with the idea of making it. You see, a friend's birthday is coming up, and since coming up with my own content is just such a chore, I asked him which legendary lore I should cover. Something a little different from our usual tradition, which is finding the foulest porn game on Steam and gifting it to each other's accounts. Now unfortunately, his first option for a legendary lore video was a Bretonnian one, and my opinion of him took a nosedive. But then he said Grom, and my opinion of him stabilized. Happy birthday, person whose name I won't dox because you are insane like Christian. Enjoy the fat bastard tag in this video. Anyways, Grom.
Please just warm it up!
Grom, I imagine, is mostly known nowadays because of Total War. He's one of those characters like Réponse de Joan of Arc, who was a background character in the lore and didn't exist in the quote-unquote modern times of Warhammer Fantasy. But either way, he's a silly little guy who's fun to talk about because he's a goblin, and the orcs and goblins have about 90% of the fun in Warhammer. So let's take a look at the big fella and see what he did in his long and glorious life. Long and glorious for a goblin, anyway. Grom began life as just one of the millions of goblins in the Warhammer world. He wasn't particularly powerful or clever or really anything like that. But that all changed one day when the goblins of his tribe, the Broken Axe, had to figure out how to keep themselves entertained since there wasn't a BWAH going on at the time. Goblins are small, you see, so they couldn't entertain themselves like the orcs usually do and just find something to beat the ever-loving snot out of for a few minutes. So they settled on an eating contest. What most of their participants ate remains lost to history. I assume it's orc shit in their own snot for the most part. But somehow, one of them managed to get their hands on some troll meat. Now, goblins aren't exactly renowned for their foresight. I mean, half of the Doomdiver catapult launchers get in there both willingly and expecting to make it out alive. So presumably Grom looked at the troll meat and went, yeah, I can handle this. Although that being said, another account of the event is that the orcs watching this mess forced him to eat it so they could watch him blow up, so who knows. Either way, Grom ate the troll meat and it started regenerating inside of him, and they say that his stomach grew 3 sizes that day. He grew bigger and bigger, and most greenskins watching by this point were just ready to see him explode like an extra on the set of The Evil Dead. But shockingly, that didn't happen. He simply continued growing, and growing, and growing. He grew so damn big he towered over not only his fellow goblins, but the orcs of the tribe. This naturally meant that upon realizing he wasn't about to explode, all the greenies of his tribe accepted him as their new war boss. I assume the previous one took exception to this, but more than likely he just ended up as an appetizer for Grom, so who cares. And so the tale of Grom de Paunch began, not with the cursed bloodline of a legendary hero like Tyrion and Teclis, or the realization that one must take the burden of power even if they don't want it like Karl Franz, but with boredom and rampant gluttony. For a while, Grom just rampaged around the Badlands, eventually acquiring a chariot to ride around in. It wasn't that he was too fat to walk, he just didn't care to anymore. It was beneath him, you understand. At one point, he assimilated a tribe of night goblins into his own by crushing the leader beneath his massive, fat gut, further proving that while it may not be because of his muscles, Grom was still the biggest, so clearly he was the boss. He also started demanding people refer to him as your immensity, because why not? He's the guy in charge. If he wants to embrace his girth, then let him own it, I say. After becoming leader of his tribe, he also came into conflict with the most prominent orc in the region, a war boss called Zok Gutstabba. If you are wondering, yes, he is very aptly named, as you'll soon find out. Upon hearing that this goblin was being very ungoblin-like, translation wasn't cowering before every orc that walked past him, he got slightly ticked off and challenged Grom to a duel on top of something called Thunder Mountain, which has got to be one of the most metal things I've ever heard in my life. Anyways, good old Zok was at least an honorable orc and demanded that no one ambush Grom while he was traveling to Zok. He was going to teach this fat bastard a lesson all by himself. So Grom shows up and Zok lives up to his name by stabbing Grom in the gut. Except there was a problem. Remember how Grom ate troll meat? He kind of inherited the troll's regenerative abilities. No, I don't know how. Put your hands down. It doesn't matter. He's a greenskin. Just assume Grom thought he would gain regenerative abilities if he ate it, and therefore he did. It's as good an answer as any I can give you. So Grom just kind of healed right up, and then absolutely brutalized Zok. Then he killed every big boss in Zok's tribe. After all this, Grom was tired, however, so he decided that now was as good a time as any to have a sit. And sit he did, directly on top of a particularly unlucky night goblin. However, instead of finding a bunch of goo in a pointy hat, the night goblin miraculously survived Grom's paunch. Grom, assuming that this was a sign that the plucky little guy was blessed by Mork, immediately promoted the goblin to being a standard bearer, which is the single highest honor Grom can give you because it means he's not going to eat you at a moment's notice. Not long after this point, hundreds of tribes were in Grom's BWAH, so it was time for them to engage in the most honored of greenskin traditions, murdering dwarfs. He marched his army straight through Blackfire Pass, and for once, history didn't repeat itself. itself. There was no heroic stand of man and dwarf to stop the greenskins, just a bunch of destroyed holds and a statue of Grungni were made to look like Grom. Imagine turning a statue of manlet Hephaestus into a statue of a sumo wrestler and you've more or less got the correct idea of what happened. The dwarf king Brigaric, that's fun to say, had finally had enough and assembled a massive army of dwarfs to take down Grom at once and for all. In another neat little subversion, the dwarfs didn't just get shit stomped, there wasn't actually a clear winner after the 3 days long battle was over. That being said, a tie for orcs is a loss for the dwarfs, because while the dwarfs lost hundreds of their most experienced and skilled warriors, the greenskins lost some big guys who would swiftly be replaced by slightly less big guys. The dwarfs realized that they couldn't do this all on their own and asked the Empire for help. The Emperor at the time responded by marshaling his forces, preparing their artillery, and nah, I'm just screwing with you. He moved the capital city from Nuln to Altdorf so it could be as far away from the fighting as reasonably possible. Ain't that just a class fucking act right there? I don't know why that's so funny to me, it's just he's like, nope. Capital's over here now. Eat shit, everyone. Have fun. It's also worth mentioning that the Warhammer Wiki calls the guy perhaps the most feckless and callow individual to ever sit upon the Imperial throne. I had to look both of those words up, but by God if they aren't fitting. Anyway, where was I? Ah yes, dying dwarves. So, the dwarves took the news of this in stride, marked the whole affair down in the book, and closed the doors to their holds. The Emperor, who was named Dieter by the way, probably just drank an extra bottle of wine that day or something in response. I don't know, and I don't really care. Unfortunately for Grom, the dwarves were sick of getting their asses kicked by him, so they shut the doors of their holds and waited. Now, Grom is very big, but not big enough to break a dwarfen castle gateway, so he decided that if the fight wasn't come to him, he was coming to the fight, and proceeded to march straight into the Empire of Man. Now here's a map of the Empire for reference. Pretty much everything south of this line got obliterated by Grom. And even above the line they weren't safe, it was just a difference between partial destruction and complete destruction. Every time an army went to fight him, it got slaughtered, or rather butchered, because they would usually eat the captives afterwards. The Empire went from glorious and strong to a bunch of isolated villages cowering behind walls. Eventually, when Grom got to Nuln, it was still the drippiest city in the Empire on account of good old Dieter caring less about defensive capability and more about shiny things. He sacked it, occupied it, then did the most un-orky thing possible. He stopped fighting. He was content. He had all the loot he could ask for, all the food his immensity could eat. Why bother leaving? Of course, the black orcs of his army disagreed with this shockingly un-greenskin behavior and pissed right off, and this was the beginning of Grom's defeat. A cousin of Dieter the shockingly stupid drove out these little bands of greenskin AWOLers and saved the Empire by securing the food supply. No resounding victory over the fat man, but hey, at least the Empire gets to live another day. Eventually, Gork and Mork were sick of Grom being a lazy prick and possessed this shaman Blacktooth, demanding that he take to the sea to find new and interesting places to burn to the ground. Filled with renewed purpose, as well as whatever the Warhammer Fantasy equivalent to KFC is, Grom once more began leading his army despite all of the attrition it had suffered. Of course, even with the Imperial raids and all the greenskins that had wandered off, Grom's army was still massive, so he smashed an army of Middenlanders no problem, and then stole the roof off of Ulrich's temple after they smashed his chariot, leaving the city of Middenheim completely unharmed. Like, not a single person killed, not a single building destroyed. Man just stole the roof of a temple to rebuild his chariot and pissed off. Alright. Whatever works for you, boss. Meanwhile, the province of Nordland wasn't so lucky, because he started ransacking it to build boats with all the wood he, acquired. Sure, he could have just had the orcs cut down trees or something instead of buildings, but where's the fun in that? What black orcs that were left complained because even though he wasn't just lazing around pretending to be an elector count, shipbuilding isn't exactly fighting. He promptly murdered and ate anyone who complained, so that shut the rest of them right up. After his armada was complete, he finally set sail. He made sure to sink half the Imperial Navy on the way out to sea, though, just because, you know, it was funny. And because the Empire of this time is just not allowed to have nice things because Magnus the Pious is dead and Karl Franz isn't around yet. Granted, once he actually got to the ocean, he lost most of his army to storms. Was it the wrath of Sigmar and Ulrich made manifest? Were Gork and Mork punishing Grom for his un-orky behavior? Or did the ships all sink because the greenskins made the fleet out of rotting wood, since green wood is surely the bestest wood? Once again, our answer has been lost to history. Speaking of lost though, either way, whatever happened, Grom lost most of his army again. It was still a big army, but remember what I said about the Black Orcs leaving because he wasn't being very fighty? By this point, all Grom had was a bunch of scared goblins, a decent amount of chariots, some wolves, and his own not inconsiderable girth. When the remains of his army finally made it to the shore, they found themselves on a rocky land shrouded in mist, with abandoned buildings all around them. Meanwhile, whatever poor elves on guard duty in the countryside version of Silent Hill that is Yvresse suddenly saw a horde of green morons crash land on their coastline and start shitting the place up, to put it in professional terms. games. I imagine it would be like if you walked into your living room and found a pack of drunken high schoolers playing football with a vase filled with grandma's ashes. Certainly interesting, definitely enraging, and mostly horrifying. This was where Gork and Mork told Grom to go. The voices in Blacktooth's head that once guided him to Ulthuan now told Grom and his army to start smashing elven waystones. Of course, by now there may or may not have been 4 voices inside of Blacktooth's head instead of 2, but that's just a meaningless detail to an orc. Someone is demanding violence. Whether or not that someone is actually a quartet of gods with a vested interest in a certain magical vortex collapsing is irrelevant. So Grom took his army and marched straight towards Terraria, the largest city left standing in the ruined region, all the while murdering anything with pointy ears that stood in his way. His army by this point was 90% useless goblins who did nothing, but he and his chariot started pasting high elves left, right, and center. Despite their best efforts, the high elves couldn't stem the tide of greenskins and were pushed back. The voices in Blacktooth's head continued demanding that they tear down elven waystones, and the greenskins dutifully did so. Eventually, the very ground beneath everyone started falling apart, and the sky was simultaneously pitch black and awash with fantastical colors, which probably would have been a sign to stop for anyone else, but these are greenskins we're talking about. Logic's for pussies, and elf rocks are fun to smash, goddammit. Blacktooth was ready to collapse one final elf waystone and bathe in unlimited power. I feel like this is the exact kind of thing that anyone in 5th grade and up could tell you is going to end in an ironic twist that doesn't benefit you at all. Like, Darth Vader technically bathed in power at the climax of Return of the Jedi. I wouldn't say he was better off for it. But whatever, orcs will be orcs, so Blacktooth went to smash the last rock while Grom was busy murdering any elf that got in his way. But Grom had made one final, fatal mistake in invading Terraria. He didn't realize that it was the home of elven Batman, Eltharion the Grim. And this Batman doesn't have a no-kill policy, so when Eltharion came back, Blacktooth got a Viking crew cut for his troubles. Elven reinforcements started pouring into the city, goblins started panicking, and Grom eventually couldn't keep control of the army anymore and fled along with it. The army itself was butchered, but no one knows what happened to Grom. Some goblins say that he resides in the mountains of Terraria itself to this very day, waiting to get his vengeance. Others say that he flew off on the very last wyvern that his army had, retreating to new lands to raise hell in. At the end of the day, as are so many things in history, it's up to us to figure out what really happened and what's legend. Actually, I'm just bullshitting you again. Grom got cut into pieces by Eltharion and shoved into a magical furnace so he couldn't regenerate. Wow. Yeah, it turns out Eltharion doesn't appreciate people burning down his home. Go figure. And then there's Total War Canon, where he survived to come at Eltharion again and also gained the ability to magically buff his army depending on what he has for dinner that day. I don't know anymore, man. It's the Orks and Goblins. Just roll with it. So there was the story of Grom the Paunch. Hope you enjoyed hearing about the lore of this fat dumbass because I enjoyed talking about it. Happy birthday again, friend who will not be named. Thanks for the free content. I now know what tags you use on Hentai because of this video. And as always, thank you to my wonderful channel members. You are the food to my immensity, allowing me to grow and prosper. Consider becoming a member or subscribing to support the channel. And either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Now I need someone to explain to me, why the fuck does Creative Assembly go so hard on their trailers? Like, this isn't what I think of when I imagine a strategy game trailer. This looks like the climax of some Lord of the Rings style Warhammer movie. There's this, there's the Vampire Coast Shanty and the Ogre Song and all the other trailers. Can someone just pay them to direct a Warhammer movie or something? I can't keep watching these trailers and getting psyched for a TV show I know doesn't exist and won't ever.